Hello, this is Mark Tooley, editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy, with another episode of Marksism with fellow Mark and fellow editor Mark Melton, missing the third leg of our triad, Mark Melton, off today, but Mark Melton and I will carry the load, examining three pieces from Providence this week. One from our contributor, Eric Patterson, on the importance of monuments as they relate to Memorial Day. Another piece by our Czech friend, whose pronunciation I always have difficulty with, Mark Lebecki. Is it Lubomir Ondrasek?
Ondrasek.
Ondrasek.
There you go.
Recalling the legacy of the first president of a post-communist Czechoslovakia, Vaclav Havel, and his refusal to hate. So we'll take a look at his reasons for not hating. And then finally, a piece from a new contributor from Stanford University, Lee Trepanier, on why Russian Christianity does not have a just war tradition. So in terms of critiquing the Russian Orthodox spiritual backing for Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Lee addressed calling upon Eastern Orthodoxy's teaching regarding human personhood, which would affirm human rights. But first, let's take a quick look at Eric Patterson's piece on the importance of monuments. Specifically, Eric is looking at what G.K. Chesterton had to say about war memorials. Specifically, apparently in Chesterton's time, monuments to great men had shifted to a more realistic pose, and Chesterton seems to have preferred the more over-the-top metaphorical pose of monuments, believing they better captured, I suppose, the grandness of the nation's majesty. Obviously, such grandness is out of fashion today on many levels, as are monuments to great persons. Can someone be great if they lived before our own time? We did not have our own contemporary attitudes. That's very much the argument today. But Mark Lebecki, do you share Chesterton's and Eric Patterson's preference for grandiose war monuments?
Yeah, a slightly qualified yes, and that I also have a place in my heart for the more straightforward, realistic ones. But sure, the soaring sort of triumphs to, as Chesterton said and Patterson quoted, those things of which we are not ashamed, those are to be welcomed. We've talked here before, and our print journal used to convey this, I think, really well, that public monuments, art pieces in general, have a pedagogical value to remind us of things we ought never to forget. And for that and many other reasons, I think public monuments are salutary. I think they're important transferers. That's not the word I want, but they help to convey important lessons from our past. I remember numerous occasions walking in parks with my kids, and they might say, "Daddy, who's that?" And if I happen to know, then I can wax eloquent on important stories about what it means to be an American, or what those who have come before us do. And I think particularly with Memorial Day, this is one of Eric Patterson's sort of ongoing efforts, is to remind us what Memorial Day actually is all about. And he'll separate it out from Veterans Day and Armed Services Day, because Americans, as he points out, we've even forgotten what Memorial Day itself means. I noted that Annapolis, of all cities, Annapolis is going to have a Memorial Day parade. I thought, oh, well, that's interesting. What would be at a Memorial Day parade? Well, there'll be veterans, there'll be first responders, and a promise of Corvettes, which is all terribly exciting, and I love to see them parade, but I'm not really sure what that has to do with those who have fallen fighting for our nation. And so, it's off by degrees. And so I think his essay is touching on the important insight that not only should we remember the statues themselves, but we should set aside particular days in which we remember, in particular, those who have fallen for our nation. So what about you? Do you like the flamboyant statues, or are you the more straight-laced, realistic statue kind of guy?
No, I appreciate the grandiose. I recently had a debate with one of our young staffers here about the apotheosis of George Washington, which is on the ceiling of the U.S. Capitol, showing Washington ascending into the heavens, accompanied by the angels and the virtues, et cetera, which I think is very wonderful. Our young staffer thought it was perhaps over the top, even idolatrous. And I said, no, metaphorically, it illustrates the greatness of the man and the greatness of the founding of America, as long as we take it in perspective and don't take it too seriously.
Right. I mean, that is as true for the dome of the Capitol as it is for pop music, right? You can't take the sentiment too literally, or
That's
it does
right.
go astray.
Yeah,
We should be able to handle metaphors. Absolutely.
we should
Good
be.
job.
Just have fun with it.
Absolutely.
In terms of Vaclav Havel and the speech whom Lubomir highlights in his article, that Vaclav, despite having been imprisoned by the communists when they still controlled Czechoslovakia, he made it a point of refusing to hate. He did not seek reprisals, was not seeking vengeance. He thought hatred represented I suppose his words, not my words, not his, a Luciferian impulse, that it was transcendent, that it was rejecting the legitimacy of the people you were hating, and that it basically was insisting that you alone represented pure truth. So hatred is especially dangerous. Havel and Lubomir believes for a new young nation throwing off the shackles from its previous tyranny. Certainly that was a wonderful example from Havel. I suppose Nelson Mandela also offered that example. And Lubomir also cites Havel's professed commitment to seeking and proclaiming the truth. It seems to me, as Christian realists, we need to be modest in claiming to have this truth, but certainly we agree we should be pursuing that truth. And Lubomir interestingly recalls the truth plays an important role in Czech history, dating all the way back to Jan Hus, the early Protestant reformer who was literally incinerated for his pursuit of the truth. So with your own ties to Czechoslovakia, Mark, your thoughts?
Yeah, and just happy historic tidbit here. Jan Hus, of course, you know what Hus means in English? Ooh, Hus means goose. And so supposedly when he was incinerated, the Catholics wrote to his followers and said, your goose is cooked. I don't know if that's true, but I want it to be.
Yes.
That aside, yeah, I like a lot of the things that Lubo is doing in his essay. I like the connection that he makes between sort of modern day wokery and the autocratic regime, which oppressed Havel and his neighbors. The fear that both have for open discourse, for the pursuit of truth, for the clash of ideas. These are all things that a free society not only benefits from, but arguably depends upon. And that there's nothing to be feared from this kind of open dialogue. If you think you've got an avenue on the truth, then you should want to hold that up to scrutiny. So all of that is good. Of course, he's right in a broad way, and even in a probably a very deep way. That hatred has a Luciferian impulse. At the same time, I don't want to be the guy who's always making a place for hate in the world, but there are some things that are hateful. And while you can parse it and say we don't hate people, we hate what they do, we hate ideas, we hate regimes, the very pursuit of truth, as I think you've suggested, suggests there are some ideas that are praiseworthy and others that are not, and we are to cling to those that are praiseworthy, and we are to abhor those that are not. And so there has to be a place for a kind of abhorrence that is legitimate. Certainly in Vaclav Havel's case, it was prudent, if nothing else, his approach toward the regime. The open displays of violence and open displays of hatred wouldn't have worked. They would have been crushed, and nothing good would have come of it. So he was, in that sense, he was transformative, and I certainly don't mean to say it was only prudential. As you said, I've some claim to the region, having lived there for 12 years, and Lubomir knows just as many stories as I do of Christians under communism who loved their communist neighbors, even the ones who were party to oppressing them. I know people who were put in prison by certain informants. And then when the tables turned and the wall came down and those informants found themselves out of public favor, they extended a hand to them and they reached out to them and they tried to help them. And that kind of witness of love and a refusal to hate at maybe a personal level can be transformative. And I think we are called to that, not just as a means to be transformative, but because it is a good in itself. So Havel, I continue to believe is a remarkable, as Lubomir says, prophet to America. Even if a secular prophet, he has a lot of good things to remind us of.
And then finally, this piece from Lee Trepanier from Samford University, saying the Russian Orthodox don't have a just war tradition. He says they don't really even have political theology, that their tradition is more automatic submission to the state and the church's collaboration or partnership with the state. So this helps to explain the lack of critique from the Russian church across centuries of various tyrannies with which it has cohabitated. But most distressingly, the Russian patriarch's support for Putin's invasion of Ukraine has scandalized many Christians around the world. So Lee suggests that there being no just war tradition for the Russian Orthodox, the church there does have a teaching regarding the human person, requiring respect, and that facilitates an understanding of human rights, and that this would be a good theological argument for the Russian Orthodox against Russia's aggression with Ukraine. Interesting, the Russian and Eastern Orthodox absence of political theology. I'm not sure all Eastern Orthodox would agree to that claim, but certainly the West, as Lee points out, has been influenced by Augustine, his idea of the two cities, or later with Luther, the two kingdoms concept. The church is, in effect, has sovereignty against the state. But you, Mark Lebecki, obviously are a just war scholar. So what say you to the Eastern Church's absence of just war teaching?
Yeah, I appreciate what I think our writer is up to, which I take to be in part. He says toward the end that the lack of a just war tradition is a poor excuse for Russian Orthodox Christians and church leaders to critique Putin. And so therefore he says you could look at your own tradition, you could turn to personhood, as you've said, in order to make that critique. I appreciate that move, but I think even that is sort of letting the Russian Orthodox Christians, in particular church leaders, too easily off the hook. It doesn't actually matter to me if you have a codified just war tradition, as Augustine and Thomas Aquinas and others have given the West. This is just me banging my old drum again, but the just war tradition isn't some sort of new kind of moral legislation that Christians developed in order to help us think through war. It is something that's rooted in natural law, rooted in scripture, rooted in human reason, that gives us a moral framework for thinking through complex situations in which goods conflict. In this particular case, when they conflict in something like a war. So it's zero excuse, whether they have a codified framework or not, for them not to be able to identify what is or is not a justified use of force, no matter how closely aligned one is with the government. The president of the United States is closely aligned with the government. He or she should always be able to indicate or to evaluate when the use of force is just or unjust. You don't need a codified mechanism to do that. So, his critique of the church's inability to make a critique is certainly spot on. The question whether or not the Orthodox Church itself has a full-blown account of just war, said that way, I think he's right. It doesn't have a full-blown account, but we've talked before in lauding a book by Alexander Webster and Darrell Cole called The Virtues of War, or The Virtue of War. Webster, who's Orthodox, goes through not a full-blown framework for just war in Orthodox thought, but what he called, just a recognized understanding of what would be or would not be justified war. And he goes through the same sorts of things I went through, that the Orthodox have a long tradition of wrestling with scripture, reading the church fathers, going through canon law, going through their sort of hagiographic literature in which they find examples of how to live through those who've come before, devotional literature, modern theologians, human reason, all of that, in order to paint something that can be called a justified war kind of framework. And Webster even goes through and finds parallels between the codified aspects that we have in the West and then the more tacit aspects that they would have in the East. So just as a sort of an in-house discussion as to whether or not they have a just war tradition, no, they don't. But they certainly have the capacity to recognize a just from an unjust war. And that, for me, that very fact, and including our writer's emphasis on personhood, condemns those in the Russian Orthodox Church who have not themselves condemned Putin. They are absolutely without excuse.
Very good. Thank you, Mark Levesque. I hope you have a celebratory and a somber way Memorial Day. I plan possibly to attend the Memorial Day parade here in Washington, D.C. Will you attend the Annapolis parade despite your concerns and misgivings?
I may just to experience it. I have a feeling it's going to be the antithesis of a Memorial Day parade, but there will be Corvettes, and so
yes.
But we will do something to certainly mark the occasion. I suspect a good war film, something to remind us of the sacrifices that far too many have made, so that we could be free.
On that note, thank you for this latest episode of Marksism. Until next week, bye-bye.